Hello vinyl community, and welcome back to another video. This is video number 3, and before I started I'd just like to thank everybody who commented and on the first 2 videos and then made some really positive comments. It was really nice to see. I was a little bit nervous starting off this whole YouTube thing because I wasn't sure whether I would be able to sort of put across what I'd like to as far as the Beatles is concerned, and I know that some of you have been doing it for a long time, so it can be quite daunting for a newbie like myself, but it was really nice to see some of the comments that you made, so thank you very much for that. So my first 2 videos have primarily been collection videos, first one UK album, second one American, and I thought for this particular video I would focus in on one album only and do a little bit of a review of it, talk a bit about the background, the recording, the impact it had, and also my personal response to it. And I discovered, quite to my surprise I think, when I did my initial video, that just how much I love this particular album, and this is, I think it's now a lot of people's #1 Beatles album, but it is certainly mine. I am of course talking about 1966's Revolver, the only Beatles studio album to come out in that year, and also an enormous step forward from their previous album. And for a long time, this record has been, I think, possibly underrated. Certainly when you put it next to Sgt. Pepper and the huge cultural impact that album had. This one didn't really have that impact at the time, but in subsequent years, particularly recently, this album tends to sit at the top of a lot of polls. And yeah, I just want to talk a little bit today about why I think that is, and a few different things around it. So yeah, this particular album is my trusty UK original. It's a mono version. As I mentioned in video 1, it was picked up for an absolute song for £3 or £4 from an antique shop, and it is, as you can see, yellow and black label, and it's in surprisingly good condition. It's obviously been well loved. I couldn't call it mint or anything like that, but plays beautifully without a skip. There's so much to talk about, I don't know where to start. What I think I'll do, I'll talk a little bit about the general expectations on the Beatles at the time. Basically, I think it's important to point out that from the moment they went to Hamburg in 1960, they were working flat out day after day, returning to Liverpool, back to Hamburg, back to Liverpool, meeting Brian Epstein, getting a record deal, and that was just the first step. And then from that moment on, after Please Please Me went to #1, they took off in England, Beatlemania took hold, and their schedule was absolutely mind-boggling by modern standards. The bottom line is that in those days they were expected to produce 3 singles a year and 2 LPs, which they managed in 1963, 1964 and 1965. In fact, I think 1963 they had 4 singles. So it's absolutely crazy pace that they were bringing things out at. And by the end of 1965, once you throw in the crazy tours, television programmes, everything that was going on in their lives, they were absolutely burnt out. And so for the first 3 months of 1966, they actually had some time off. And they used it wisely. I'm sure they went on holiday, etc, etc. But what they did certainly in that time was to experiment a little bit more with certain mind-expanding drugs. Not least Mr. John Lennon, who, upon returning to Abbey Road in April 1966, brings in what became the final track on this album, which at the time was called Mark 1, and was by far the most far-out thing the Beatles had recorded up to that point. Of course, I'm talking about Tomorrow Never Knows here. And I think that kind of set the pace, really, for those recording sessions. And throughout the next 3 months or so of making this album, they were pushing the envelope repeatedly, not trying to repeat themselves. As successful as Rubber Soul had been, and as much more mature record as that was, Revolver was a massive, massive leap. And every single track is outstanding in one way or another. So I'm just going to go through each track and say a little bit about each one. So the record starts off with Taxman, George Harrison composition, arguably his best one to date. Believe he had a little bit of help lyrically from John, and was of course a biting commentary on the tax situation in Britain at the time, where they were paying 19 shillings out of every pound, I think, to the taxman for the high earners. And George really went for the jugular in this one. Absolutely brilliant production. Paul plays a incredible solo, sort of Indian influenced almost. It sounds almost raga. So great way to open it, and of course that bass line from Paul as well. Much imitated, in fact blatantly imitated by the Jam later on. So the album starts off in style. And then we have the huge contrast of Eleanor Rigby, track 2, which is unlike anything that they'd ever done before. Obviously Paul had done Yesterday in the previous year, but this was even more of a departure, because Yesterday of course had the acoustic guitar plus the string quartet, and this is entirely, there isn't a single Beatle playing on this. This is a string octet. Absolutely incredible score by George Martin, which you can hear isolated on Anthology 2, and a slightly different version of it on the Love album as well. It's the most, if you were to talk to anyone about George Martin's value to the Beatles, you would point certainly to Eleanor Rigby, you would point to I Am the Walrus, you would point to Strawberry Fields. Just an absolutely astonishing arranger for these guys, and what a collaboration they had. And the lyrical content of Eleanor Rigby, just so mature, and if you put it alongside what other bands were doing at the time, the Beatles were just on a different plateau completely. On to track 3. John Lennon's first appearance on this album, I'm Only Sleeping. Typically lethargic composition from John. He'd spent 3 months possibly doing just that. But it's all about the production. Slightly vari-speeded vocals, an astonishing backwards guitar, which, as far as I'm aware, George Harrison worked out forwards, then it was transcribed backwards for him to play backwards, so then when they flipped the tape you had a quite melodic sounding guitar solo but backwards. And this is what they could do now. They were the Beatles, they were the biggest thing in the world, and they had time to experiment and produce these absolutely amazing pieces of work. And track 4 to listeners in 1966 would have been quite a shock, because even though a sitar appeared on Norwegian Wood the previous year, you've got full-on Indian instrumentation, so sitar, tablas, etc., which is George's Love You Too, his second appearance on the album. I think going through this track list, I'm now working out, at least in my head, why Revolver is so revered. It's because from track to track you just get the Beatles' massive versatility, from one style to another. We've had rock, we've had chamber music, we've had psychedelic backwards guitar, we've had Indian, and now we have a beautiful ballad. Classic McCartney, certainly one of my top 5 Beatles songs. Here, There and Everywhere. It's difficult to know what to say about this one, really. It's just exquisite melody. Beautiful block harmonies from John, Paul and George. Amazing key change in the middle 8. Just the way it completely moves into a different gear and then back home again for the verses. Perfection. And what was I just saying about variety? We have possibly Ringo's most famous Beatles song, alongside With a Little Help, which is of course Yellow Submarine. Much maligned, much mocked, but you try not to sing along to it when it comes on. You try and skip it. Yellow Submarine is, again, a lovely song, great fun recording. By all accounts, Abbey Road was full of buckets of water with chains being pulled around, and we had the sort of John's goon voices in the background, the brass band, and Ringo having great fun on lead vocals and a studio singing along at the end. Yellow Submarine, guys. It is what it is, and I think it's wonderful. If there was going to be if I was to make a list of underrated Beatles songs, the Closer to side 1 is right up there. She Said, She Said. Absolutely. I adore She Said, She Said. Amazing guitar work. Lennon's typical rhythmic bizarreness. We're in and out of different time signatures. And it's so satisfying that When I Was a Boy, middle section's completely different from the verses. Amazing drumming performance from Ringo. Again, Ringo, much mocked, much maligned, but he does it. He plays on these complicated tracks and he knocks it out of the park every single time. Inspired, of course, by an LSD trip that the Beatles had with Peter Fonda, where he was saying, I know what it's like to be dead, and freaking everybody out. And John, of course, went away and did what he does best. Side 2 begins with Good Day Sunshine. Literally, it feels like the sun is coming out when you hear that song. Great barrel house piano from George Martin. Again, lovely little key changes in the chorus. Sumptuous harmonies. It feels like summer, this song. Great opener. Another on my list of favourite songs, And Your Bird Can Sing, comes next. What a riff. John and George playing dual lead guitar on this one. There was quite a famous outtake of this song which appears on Anthology 2, which is more birdsy, where John and Paul sing in harmony throughout and are cracking up with laughter over the top of it, which is quite a fun little outtake. But the original is just amazing. Next song, For No One. Another lesser known Beatles song, I guess, if there is such a thing. But Paul McCartney was, I think, was the world's greatest songwriter at this point in 1966. I think his work on Revolver is unsurpassed. I think it was the best stuff he ever did. And yeah, and I guess later on when he was producing, let's say, less than inspiring stuff, you look back and say, well, he could do this. And For No One, it's very un-McCartney as well. Yes, it's a scenario song that he used to write, but he just gets right under the skin of a relationship that's gone wrong. Beautiful French horn solo in the middle of that as well. On to Dr. Robert, lovely rock and roll song, again drug related, as a lot of things were at this time. We then have I Want to Tell You, George's third appearance on a Beatles album, which again was unheard of. Love the riff. There was a great version of this at the concert for George, played by his friends, which I really like. And there's a nice piano part in the background played by Paul, which is quite discordant and things like that. Got to Get You Into My Life. Wow, incredible brass section on that. Again, a little bit like Good Day Sunshine, just makes you smile. Amazing vocal performance from Paul. And to top it all off, the song that I started talking about at the beginning, Tomorrow Never Knows. Huge departure for the Beatles. Studio trickery on show all the way through. John famously said to George Martin he wanted to sound like the Dalai Lama singing from a hilltop. So they put his voice through a rotating Leslie speaker, and that's what you hear for the second half of the song. Lyrics inspired by the Tibetan Book of the Dead. You had sort of Paul's invention of the tape loops that go throughout the song, and just an absolutely incredible 14 songs. You just cannot beat it. I've also got, alongside this one, I talked about the American version, which does not hold a candle to the British version, but there it is, missing those 3 Lennon songs, and as a result, not anywhere near the British version. I've got the 2009 CD remaster, comes with a lovely little booklet, stereo, great stuff. And finally, this is the mono remaster from the Beatles in mono box set, and this is the best this album sounds in my collection. Absolutely amazing. And yeah. So just before I finish up, I've been reading a book of late, which relates very well to this, and I can't recommend this highly enough. It's a book by Robert Rodriguez, who is one of the co-presenters of the Something About the Beatles podcast, which I heartily recommend. The Revolver, How the Beatles Reimagined Rock and Roll. It's a really great read, and just gives you a lot more depth about where this record stood at the time, the influence it's had since, and the effect it's had on subsequent musicians and things like that. But I really enjoyed it, and I saw the record in a very different way after reading it. So yes, so that's it. That is my Revolver review. I really hope you've enjoyed watching it. I'll be interesting to read your comments about what you think about Revolver, whether you agree it's top of the pile or not, and why. And I look forward to talking some more about this album to you. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. I'm very excited about what I'm going to do next, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.